The early Italian Renaissance. At the end of the Middle Ages in Italy, the most important Italian cultural centers were north of Rome. Cities like Florence, Milan, Venice, and also the duchies of Mantua, Ferrara, and Urbino. Much of the power and influential art patronage was in the hands of wealthy families. The one that we talk about the most with the Renaissance is the Medici in Florence, but there are several powerful families in these other cities. Now, Italy at this time is not a country. It was divided into small entities, but it did have a common heritage. They were descendant from ancient Rome. Ancient Rome provided a unifying ideals of power and wealth and culture. Cities grew in wealth and independence as people moved to them from the country in huge numbers. Commerce becomes important, and the people in charge aren't necessarily the traditional noble families that we've had before. Instead, they just have a lot of money, so the merchant class can rise to be one of these powerful type families. The period also saw a rise in mercenary armies, so knights don't play as big of a role as they did before. Wealthy families support the arts because they served the glory of God, to honor their city, and of course to commemorate themselves and their families. Civic pride also rises in importance. We saw that a little bit in the Gothic period, and it's expanded here. The patronage of the arts was an important public activity during this time, with political overtones. Italian humanists had a new sense of the importance of human thought and action. So they looked to the past accomplishments for inspiration and instruction. This is the time that's really seen as the rebirth of the classics, which we now call the Renaissance. During this time, the wealthy began collecting libraries of books, sculptures, fragments of architecture from the Roman period. And there's also some archaeological, and you can't see me, but I'm actually putting that in air quotes, basically like pot hunting investigations of ancient Rome. So just basically like treasure hunters. But still, they're getting to see a lot of these classical things that they haven't gotten to see for a really long time. Some of the sketches that are made of these buildings and artworks that they're discovering during this time are really valuable for today because they don't survive in that condition. 15th century Italians constructed a golden age of philosophy, literature, and the arts. They had kind of a romantic view of the classic period, and they hoped to recapture that period's greatness. Artists turned to classical inspiration, and there were very few examples of ancient Roman painting known during this period, so mostly they're going to be looking at sculpture and literature that talks about the art from the classical period. Of course, when I say the classical period, I mean ancient Rome and Greece. However, during this time, the prominent subject matter is going to be Christian narratives. There are secular works, but those are usually portraits. Few other secular arts survive until the second half of the 15th century. Later in the 15th century, we're actually going to get to see allegorical and mythological themes. So that'll be a marked difference from this early Renaissance to this kind of later period. During this period, patrons will begin collecting art for their own personal enjoyment. So that's why we start to see more allegorical and mythological themes instead of just Christian themes. Also during this period, the male nude returns to art. So we actually haven't seen the male nude in a really long time. I know you've missed it. So we are going to get to see it again. So it became an acceptable subject matter, and they justify it because it becomes part of religious imagery. So we can see it in the depiction of like Adam or David or somebody like that. Now female nudes are rare in the Renaissance. Sometimes Eve or Venus appears. Nude females make a comeback at the end of the 15th century. Like the Flemish, the Italian artists are slowly moving towards greater precision in rendering the illusion of reality. They do it differently though. They're more analytical about it. they have a goal of achieving a correct but perfected version of reality. They want figures to be set in rational space rather than visually defined space. And one of the ways they do this is they use linear perspective. And you actually have a video that you can watch that explains linear perspective pretty well. I'm going to kind of fast forward here to Donatello, because your book really doesn't do him justice. They talk about him a little bit, but Donatello is pretty much like the most awesome sculptor of his time. He's awesome because he constantly explores human emotion and expressions. He has vision and insight in representing the formal problems inherent in his subjects, and he has this ability to solve technical problems posed by mediums, so bronze, marble, wood, etc. So basically he is really innovative, very creative, and very technically creative. His art conveys this immediacy and is rather careless of surface refinements, but he's able to reach a really high level of force and drama. Now, he was known as being an intense and impulsive person, and I think this actually kind of conveys in his art a little bit. He's fascinated by the inner life of subjects and naturalistic effects that he observed in the world around him. He does work as a goldsmith for a while. He may have been a student or a peer or a friend of Brunelleschi. We also know that he worked under Ghiberti and worked on some of his statues of Orsa Macale. Donatello created the first life-size freestanding male nude since antiquity, and that's what we're looking at here. This is his David from 1446 to 1460. We're actually not really sure when he made this. It is made of bronze, and it's actually a really unusual looking David. He is depicted as basically a boy, like 12 to 13 years old. He wears only boots and a hat, and he's crowned with laurel. So if you can see that on his hat, maybe a little bit here. His hat, he's crowned with laurel. He has one hand on his hip, and the other holds a sword. His right foot is on a wreath, and his left foot is on the head of Goliath. Here's a couple other images, maybe you can see a little better. So there's like a wing attached to Goliath's helmet, and that actually goes up David's leg. And here is a close-up you can see of Goliath's head and helmet. The David was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, that powerful Florence family. And the Medici liked to connect themselves with the theme of David versus Goliath. They saw themselves as David, saving Florence from external forces represented by Goliath. When we look at David's body, it is not like those classical athletic male nudes that we're used to looking at. Instead, we do see him looking very young, very childlike. When we look at his expression, it looks pensive, almost as if maybe his lips are like slightly parted, maybe he is catching his breath. So Donatello has chosen to depict the moment after David has already defeated Goliath. So perhaps he's thinking about what he's doing. It's kind of up to us what we think he is thinking about or what he is doing. Or maybe he's just like, whew, glad that's over. And here you can just see some of the great detail. I love this detail in his armor here. Here's some more detail. So this is actually like this part of Goliath's helmet right here. And this is a scene of Cupid and Psyche drawn in a chariot by these kind of pooty love figures. So this is pretty standard Donatello stuff. I think you see a couple in his book, in your book, that is actually pretty similar to this. But I wanted to bring in this one really quick just to show you why I'm so impressed with Donatello. I know I'm not supposed to give you my personal opinion, but I do think it's really interesting where he ends up going with his art. Now, Donatello thrives under the competitive nature of Florence. He goes to Padua for a while. Everybody loves him there. And so he hates it. So he actually ends up returning later and this is what he creates when he returns to Florence. So this is one of his late works. He actually becomes obsessed with expressionism, and he inspires some artists to add psychological intensity to their subjects. The Penitent Magdalene that we're looking at here is actually created of wood, polychrome, and gilded. It's gilded. Originally, it would have been painted tan, or at least her skin would have, and there would have been gilded highlights in her hair. Mary Magdalene is known from the Bible as being very physically beautiful, but here she is shown as emaciated, with vacant eyes. She basically looks like she's starving to death, because indeed she was. So after Christ's death, and this is based on the book The Golden Legend, which is a book about the saints from the Middle Ages, Mary Magdalene becomes a hermit, and she ends up being clothed only by her hair. She spends 30 years in solitude, in the wilderness, and here she is depicted in that state. She's in a state of physical deterioration. She is old. She has basically starved herself and not taken care of her body because she's so consumed by her love for Christ. Now, nothing is left to her but her vision of the hereafter, and for her, that is her everything. And I think Donatello does a really great job of portraying that. This looks like a woman who doesn't care about earthly anything, earthly possessions, food, even taking care of herself. Instead, she becomes obsessed with the glory of God, the glory of Christ. Donatello totally rejects the classical ideal form in favor of the powerful force of Mary Magdalene's personality and emotions and her situation. She looks skeletal. She has sunken cheeks. She looks almost toothless. You can actually see if you look closely that she's missing teeth. Her mouth is slightly open so she can murmur prayers. She's still in that kind of subtle contrapposto stance, but still like that spear bearer, if you remember from the Greek period stance. Really, this is a study of what the ravages of time and decay will do to the body, and it is a study of intense individualism.